My name is Vivian and I am 31 years old. 6 months after I buried my husband, my own mother sat at my kitchen table and told me I had 30 days to sign my house over to my brother. She didn't even bring it up gently. She set a manila folder on the table next to my coffee mug, right where Daniel used to sit, and slid it toward me like she was handing me a menu. "This is just temporary," she said. "Until you get back on your feet." My brother sat across from her, arms crossed, already looking at the walls of my dining room like he was measuring them for his own furniture. My father didn't say a word, he never did. He just nodded along, the way he'd nodded along to everything my mother decided since I was a kid. What none of them knew was that in 11 days I was going to walk into a federal courthouse, take off my coat, and watch the company my brother had built on my husband's stolen identity collapse in front of a judge. I should back up. Daniel and I bought our house in Asheville, North Carolina almost 4 years ago. It wasn't a mansion, but it was ours. A craftsman bungalow with a wraparound porch and a garden out back that Daniel had spent 2 summers turning into something out of a magazine. He grew tomatoes the size of softballs and complained every year that the deer ate them before he got the chance. I used to tease him that he loved that garden more than he loved me, and he'd say, "Vivian, I can have both," and kiss the top of my head like it settled the argument. He died on a Tuesday, an aneurysm, the doctor said, sudden, nothing anyone could have done. He was 36. One minute he was loading the dishwasher and telling me about a phone call he'd had with his business partner, and the next minute he was on the kitchen floor, and I was screaming into a phone that wouldn't stop ringing in my ear. I don't remember most of the next 2 months. I remember casseroles. I remember my mother showing up at the funeral in a black dress that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage, hugging me stiffly and saying, "You'll get through this, Vivian, you're stronger than you think." I remember thinking at the time that it sounded like comfort. I didn't understand yet that it was a warning. My family has always operated on a simple hierarchy. My father, Walter, that's not right. I need a different name for him in my head. Let's say my father, Gerald, built a small but successful real estate holding company 30 years ago, the kind of business that quietly owns a dozen strip malls and apartment complexes around town and never makes the news. My mother, Pamela, ran the house and ran my father in that order. And my brother, Tobias, was the heir apparent from the moment he was born. Tobias got the company car at 16. Tobias got sent to the best business school in the state. Tobias got forgiven every time he showed up late, drunk, or empty-handed, because that was simply how things worked in our family. I got told at 22 that I was the creative one, which in my family's language meant I wasn't worth investing in. I didn't fight it. I left. I got a finance degree on my own dime, working nights at a hotel front desk to pay for it, and I built a career as a forensic accountant, the kind of person companies hire when they suspect someone on the inside is stealing from them. It is quiet work, methodical work. The kind of work nobody at my family's table ever asked me a single question about, because to them, numbers on a spreadsheet weren't as impressive as a corner office with your name on the door. Daniel understood it though. Daniel had grown up working class in Ohio, the son of a mechanic, and he used to say that watching me trace a 6-figure embezzlement back through 11 shell accounts was the most attractive thing he'd ever seen a person do. He worked in commercial lending, which is how, 4 years ago, he ended up reviewing a loan application for a real estate holding company that wanted to refinance 3 properties at once. The company was called Brightline Equity Partners. The man who signed the application was my brother Tobias. Daniel never told me the details of that loan, banking ethics, confidentiality, all of it. But I remember him coming home that night unusually quiet, and when I asked what was wrong, he just said, "Your brother's company has a debt-to-asset ratio that doesn't add up. I'm not approving it as submitted." I remember being almost proud of him for saying no to my own family. I didn't think much more about it. That was 4 years ago, and Daniel never brought it up again. I assumed the loan had gotten reworked, approved through someone else, and life moved on. It hadn't gotten reworked. It had gotten buried. I wouldn't understand that until much later. The dinner where they ambushed me happened 4 months after the funeral, in October, the kind of crisp Carolina evening where the leaves had just started turning and the whole town smelled like wood smoke. My mother had called and insisted on coming to my house this time to see how you're managing on your own, which should have been my first clue. She showed up with Tobias in tow and my father trailing a step behind both of them like always. I'd made a pot roast. I don't know why that detail sticks with me, but it does. I remember standing at the stove that afternoon, thinking that cooking for them was an old habit I couldn't quite kill, this need to prove I could hold a household together even while I was falling apart inside it. We sat down. My mother made small talk about her garden club for exactly 4 minutes before she set down her fork and said, "Vivian, we need to talk about practical matters." That was always her phrase for ambushes. Practical matters. You can't keep this house, she said. You don't have Daniel's income anymore. You're a bookkeeper. I'm a forensic accountant, I said. A bookkeeper, she continued, like I hadn't spoken. And this house is too much for one person. Tobias has agreed to take over the mortgage and the deed, and you can move into the carriage house behind our place. It's practically furnished already. I looked at my brother. He didn't even have the decency to look uncomfortable. He just reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder the way you'd produce a winning hand at a poker table and slid it across to me. "It's already drawn up," he said. "Quitclaim deed. All you have to do is sign. We'll handle the rest. The insurance payout too, since you'll need help managing that kind of money responsibly." You were never good with finances, Viv, you know that. I want to tell you that I screamed, that I stood up and threw the pot roast across the room, that I gave some triumphant speech right there at the table. I didn't. I sat very still, the way I'd learned to sit still in that family my entire life, and I said, "I need some time to think about it." "You have 30 days, my brother said, like he was doing me a favor. "After that, we go a different route." I knew exactly what a different route meant in my family's language. It meant lawyers. It meant pressure. It meant my mother calling every relative we had and painting me as an unstable widow who couldn't be trusted with a $1.8 million house and a life insurance payout that frankly none of them had any legal claim to whatsoever. What none of them knew, what I hadn't told a single member of my family, was that 2 weeks after Daniel's funeral, while going through his old work files, because the bank needed me to close out his accounts, I had found a flash drive taped to the inside of his desk drawer. On it was a folder labeled, in Daniel's careful handwriting on the drive itself, "Brightline Keep." I am not a person who ignores a labeled flash drive. What I found on it took me 3 weeks of late nights, after the house had gone quiet, and grief had nowhere left to go but into spreadsheets, because that is the only language I have ever fully trusted. Brightline Equity Partners, my brother's company, had been laundering money through a network of shell LLCs registered to addresses that turned out to be UPS stores in 4 different states. The loan Daniel had rejected 4 years ago hadn't been rejected because of a bad debt ratio. It had been rejected because Daniel discovered that 2 of the properties Brightline listed as collateral didn't actually belong to Brightline. They'd been quietly transferred out of an elderly client's trust account that my father's firm managed. A woman named Eleanor Whitfield, who had been in a memory care facility since before I got married, and who almost certainly had no idea her properties had been used as collateral for a loan she never signed off on. Daniel hadn't just rejected the loan, he'd started keeping records. Bank statement printouts, screenshots of internal emails someone, I still don't know who, maybe a junior associate with a conscience, had forwarded him. He'd flagged it to his compliance department. And then, 8 months later, the file had simply gone cold. The compliance investigation closed with a note that read, "Insufficient evidence, client relationship preserved." Brightline was, after all, a long-standing client of the bank. My father's company brought them a great deal of business. I don't know if Daniel was planning to do something with what he found. I'll never know. He died with that flash drive taped to the inside of his desk drawer, and never said a word to me about any of it. Maybe to protect me, maybe because he was still building the case, maybe because some part of him knew exactly whose family he'd be detonating, but I knew what to do with it. It is, after all, the only thing I've ever been good at, according to my own mother. I spent those 30 days my brother so generously allotted me very differently than they expected. I did not call a lawyer to fight the eviction because I didn't need to. The house was in my name and Daniel's, free and clear, and no quitclaim deed signs itself. What I did instead was drive to Eleanor Whitfield's memory care facility, and using the legal authority Daniel had as a former loan officer with documented concerns, request, gently, carefully, with the help of an elder law attorney I hired using my own savings, not a cent of my family's money, a forensic review of her trust account. I filed a confidential complaint with the state's Department of Financial Institutions. And because forensic accountants tend to know other forensic accountants, I made a phone call to a former colleague who now worked as a financial crimes investigator for the FBI's field office in Charlotte. I did not tell my family any of this. I let them believe I was exactly who they thought I was. A quiet, grieving, slightly overwhelmed widow, running out the clock on a deadline they assumed I'd caved to. I went to 2 more family dinners during those 30 days. I let my mother refer to me, to my face, as fragile right now. I let Tobias ask with a smirk whether I'd thought more about the carriage house. I smiled and said I needed more time. Every single time I drove home and opened my laptop and kept working. On the 29th day, an FBI agent named Diane, no, I need to call her something else. An investigator named Renata Cole called me and said, "We're ready to move. There's a hearing Thursday, you should be there." I want to tell you I felt triumphant in that moment. Mostly I just felt tired and a little sick, because no matter how thoroughly my brother had earned what was coming to him, he was still my brother, and some small, stupid, 4-year-old part of me still remembered him teaching me to ride a bike in our driveway, before he learned that being cruel to me was easier than being kind. The hearing was not the dramatic courtroom showdown you see in movies. It was a federal civil forfeiture proceeding, the kind that happens in front of a judge with almost no audience, where attorneys speak in clipped, procedural language about asset freezes and material misrepresentation. My family did not know I would be there. They found out when they walked in. My mother saw me first. I watched her face do something I had genuinely never seen it do before, a kind of confused recalibration, like her brain couldn't process why I was sitting on the opposite side of the room from her, next to a federal investigator instead of next to my family. My father looked at the floor, the way he always did when something was happening that he couldn't control. Tobias looked at me with an expression I'll remember for the rest of my life. Not fear yet, just disbelief. Like I was a math problem that had stopped making sense. Brightline's attorney, a sharp, expensive-looking man named Ktten Revenge, stood up and made an opening statement about how this was clearly a mistake, a misunderstanding of standard real estate financing practices. He had not, it was obvious, been briefed on the full scope of what Renata's team had assembled. That was when I stood up. I hadn't been asked to speak. Technically, I wasn't even a formal party to the proceeding yet. I was there as a witness, a financial consultant to the investigation. But the judge, a tired-looking woman named Judge Marisol Ferreira, who had clearly seen every flavor of family financial crime a small southern city could produce, looked at me over her glasses and said, "You wanted to be heard, Miss Calloway?" I unzipped the folder I'd brought. I took off my coat, because the courtroom was warm and because, if I am honest with myself, looking back, some part of me wanted my brother to see that I wasn't the cold, fragile woman in a black cardigan he'd watched cry at a funeral 4 months earlier. I was wearing the navy suit I used to wear to forensic accounting depositions, the one I hadn't put on since before Daniel died, because there had been nothing in my life that felt like it required armor since then. Until now. "My name is Vivian Calloway," I said. "I'm a certified forensic accountant." 18 months before his death, my husband flagged a discrepancy in a loan application submitted by Brightline Equity Partners. That discrepancy involved 2 properties listed as collateral that did not in fact belong to Brightline. They belonged to the trust of a woman named Eleanor Whitfield, a client of Callaway Holdings. My father's firm, the firm that bore our name, the name I'd been born with, who has been incapacitated and unable to consent to any transaction involving her assets since 2021. I laid out the shell company structure. I laid out the UPS store addresses. I laid out in language a judge with no patience for theatrics could follow in about 4 minutes, exactly how my brother had spent 3 years moving money through Brightline using an elderly woman's stolen collateral, how my father's firm had either missed it or chosen not to see it, and how 4 months after my husband died, the same family had sat at my dinner table and tried to pressure me into signing over a house and a life insurance settlement because they assumed grief had made me too weak to notice that my own brother was functionally a thief. Ktten Revenge tried to object twice. The judge let me finish both times. When I sat back down, my mother was staring at me like she had never seen me before in her life. Maybe she hadn't. I don't think any of them had ever actually looked at me, not really. Not since I was small enough that my opinions didn't threaten anyone's plans. The investigation took another 4 months to fully unwind. Brightline's accounts were frozen within the week. My father's firm lost Eleanor Whitfield's trust as a client immediately and was placed under a state regulatory review that, last I heard, was still ongoing and not going well for him. Tobias was indicted on charges of wire fraud and exploitation of a vulnerable adult. He eventually took a plea deal that kept him out of trial but did not keep him out of prison, 18 months. Plus restitution he will likely be paying off for the rest of his working life. My mother hired a lawyer of her own, not for Tobias but to determine whether she could be held personally liable for the carriage house she'd already started renovating in anticipation of moving me into it. As far as I know, she could not be held liable. She was, it turned out, simply complicit in spirit, which carries no criminal penalty, only the kind of penalty you pay in family dinners nobody invites you to anymore. I never moved into the carriage house. I'm still in the craftsman bungalow with the wraparound porch. I let Daniel's garden go a little wild last spring because I didn't have it in me to weed it. And then in June, I went out one Saturday morning with a cup of coffee and found that the tomatoes had come back anyway, on their own, seeding themselves from whatever Daniel had planted the year before he died. I sat on the steps and cried for the first time in months, not because of my family but because of him, because some things you plant outlive you whether anyone tends them or not. My family does not call me anymore. Occasionally my father sends a birthday card, no note inside, just his signature, like a man checking a box. I used to think that would devastate me. It doesn't, not really. What devastates me some nights is how easy it was for them to look at a grieving widow and see only an asset to be managed, a house to be claimed, a woman too soft to notice what was happening right in front of her. They were wrong about that. They were wrong about almost everything, actually. But I think the thing I'll remember longest isn't the hearing, or the indictment, or even the look on my brother's face when he finally understood what I'd done. It's standing in that warm courtroom, taking off my coat, and realizing that I wasn't protecting myself anymore. I was simply done being underestimated.